Chapter 1. The Shattering of the Glass. Swan. It was a bitter November evening when the glass swan died its second death. Outside the Château d'Elegance, perched like a forgotten crown in the hills above Lausanne, the wind curled through the pines with an almost human cry. Inside, the Mosaic room glowed with candlelight and grandeur, its walls inlaid with ancient Venetian glass and mirrored tiles that shimmered like the surface of a disturbed dream. Guests wandered in, cloaked in finery and secrets. The centerpiece of the evening was unveiled at precisely 8 o'clock. The legendary glass swan of Thessalonica, thought destroyed over a century ago in war, now miraculously restored and presented by Lady Delphine Breval, widow of the controversial financier Edouard Breval. Delphine stood beside the sculpture, resplendent in a sable gown, her pale face veiled lightly in black netting. Her guests circled the piece in hushed awe. There were 6 of them. Lord Howard Chatham, a stiff-jawed British diplomat with an unreadable gaze and a reputation for quiet ruthlessness. Madame Giselle Fontaine, a blind composer of radical operas whose dark glasses and sharper tongue were equally famous. Alaric Ventnor, an aging art dealer with a stupor, liver spots, and a laugh like old wood cracking. Marc Delafosse, Breval's former business partner, a man with expensive charm and a strangely unplaceable accent. Livia Duval, a spiritualist medium known for theatrical séances and unnervingly accurate insights. And Madame Célestine Charron, historian, confidante of Delphine, and the curator responsible for retrieving the swan from a monastery's wine crypt. Célestine had retired to her suite early, complaining of fatigue. The rest stayed, sipping wine and admiring the iridescent sculpture. Under the glow of the glass-domed skylight, the swan seemed to move, its posture regal, its long neck arching as though aware of its audience. Then came the shatter. A sound, high, sharp, ringing like the last note of a crystal bell, pierced the room. The skylight above cracked, groaned, and collapsed. A sheet of jagged glass plummeted directly onto the sculpture. The swan burst apart in a shower of light and dust and knives. Screams, shouts. Someone, Marc perhaps, grabbed Delphine, shielding her from flying shards. Giselle stood calmly, blinking behind her veil. Lord Chatham stepped backward without a word. Blood beaded on Alaric Ventnor's forearm, though he barely seemed to notice. And then another scream from outside the room. It was Mademoiselle Yvette, Delphine's housekeeper, pale as salt, trembling at the doorway. Oh Dieu, there's been a death," she gasped. "Madame Célestine, she's gone." Panic froze the guests in place. The group hurried to Célestine's suite. The door had not been locked. Inside, the fire had gone out. One window was slightly ajar, and Madame Célestine Charron lay on the floor beside her writing desk, a porcelain teacup shattered near her outstretched hand. Her head was twisted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes, blue, cloudy, forever open, stared into the nothingness of the room. The doctor arrived from the village before midnight. "Heart failure," he muttered, gently closing her eyes. "She must have fallen when it struck." But Delphine said nothing. Instead, she stood beside her dead friend's body, her hand tight around the silver pendant at her throat, the shadows swallowing half her face. And when the doctor left, when the guests retreated into murmured paranoia, Delphine made a decision. She approached the fireplace, tore a page from the guest book with a quill, and scribbled 3 words. Then she handed it to her steward. "Send this by wire," she said. "Not to the police. Not yet. I want a mind sharper than all of ours, a mind that does not believe in accidents." The steward nodded. The name was short, the message simple. Hercule Poirot, Lausanne. Château d'Elegance requires your discretion. A swan is shattered. A friend is dead. Chapter 2. Poirot arrives beneath the snowlight. The snow was falling in earnest by the time Hercule Poirot arrived. His black overcoat, crisply pressed and without a single flake upon it, gave him the appearance of a man immune to the weather. A small, perfectly curved mustache sat atop his upper lip like a crown of order. From the tip of his patent leather shoes to the tilt of his grey Homburg hat, Poirot moved with unshakable elegance, like a man who imposed symmetry on the world merely by observing it. A liveried servant opened the heavy oak doors of Château d'Elegance just as the detective approached the final step. "Monsieur Poirot," said the steward solemnly, "Madame Breval awaits you in the Salon du Cygne." "Merci, mon ami," Poirot replied, handing over his gloves. "The journey was a little tedious, but I feel it in my bones. There is something, how shall we say, disordered here." He passed through corridors hushed by winter and watched by tapestries. The walls bore portraits of Breval's past, dour men and severe women with names lost to time. The house did not welcome easily. It was absorbed. In the Salon du Cygne, so named for the embroidered swans stitched into its velvet furniture, Lady Delphine Breval waited by the fireplace, cloaked in shadow and silver. Her gown tonight was deep emerald, the color of moss under moonlight. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly as he entered, "I thank you for coming so swiftly." "But of course," he replied, bowing slightly. "A lady is distressed, a friend is dead, and a most priceless object, a glass swan, has met a fate too theatrical for mere chance. Eh bien, how could I resist?" She smiled faintly. "I had a feeling you would understand." They sat. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. "I assume, madame," Poirot said, "that you do not believe the death of Madame Célestine was natural." "No," she said simply. "Yet the doctor has said—" "I know what he said, but I knew her. She was a woman of balance, of ritual. She did not faint, she did not stumble." Poirot nodded, fingers steepled. "And this friend of yours? She had enemies?" Delphine hesitated. "Not enemies, not exactly, but Célestine had uncovered things." "What sort of things?" Delphine leaned forward. "My husband's affairs, the provenance of the swan, the recent changes to the family trust. She had started locking her bedroom drawers. She no longer drank wine in the Mosaic room. She said it dulled her, and 2 days ago she told me something chilling." Poirot tilted his head. "She said, 'Delphine, there is something buried in the glass, a memory someone has tried to forget, and they are frightened it might return.'" "Ah," Poirot murmured. "That is not a statement born of heart trouble." "No," Delphine whispered. "It is born of fear." There was a knock at the door. The steward reappeared. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "the guests are still in their suites. Shall I summon them?" Poirot stood. "No, not yet. I would like to walk the house. Alone. And then I would like to see where Madame Célestine died." He paused by the door, eyes scanning the embroidered swans. "And, madame," he said thoughtfully, "you mentioned the Mosaic room earlier. Has anyone returned to it since the accident?" "No," Delphine replied. "It's been sealed until your arrival." Poirot gave a curt nod. "Good. I wish to be the first, apart from the culprit, of course." The Mosaic room had not lost its grandeur. Even with the glass dome shattered and the centerpiece gone, its kaleidoscopic tiles still danced in candlelight, a fractured dream cast in color. Poirot walked its length slowly, his shoes clicking lightly on polished stone. Near the pedestal where the glass swan once stood, he crouched. A single shard remained, clear, thin, no larger than a sliver of ice. He picked it up with a gloved hand, holding it to the light. Then he looked up. High above, in the fractured remains of the skylight, a corner panel remained strangely intact. In it, unlike the others, was a patterned etching, not ornamental but geometric, like the corner of a cipher. Curious, he murmured. Most curious. He tucked the shard into a handkerchief and turned toward the corridor leading to the guest rooms. Madame Célestine Charon's suite was austere compared to the others. A narrow bed, a mahogany desk, a wardrobe with worn brass hinges. Her suitcase was still packed, half unzipped, a sprig of lavender tucked between her nightgowns. Poirot examined the broken teacup beside the bed. Then the porcelain saucer, which remained intact on the nightstand. He sniffed the rim of the teacup. A faint bitterness lingered, like almond and something metallic. On the desk sat an unfinished letter. He leaned closer. And if anything should happen, Delphine will know. She has always known. The swan was never just art. It was confession, and the person who fears it will not rest until all memories are scattered. There was no signature. Poirot stood still for a long moment. Then he whispered to the empty room. Mademoiselle Célestine, you saw too clearly. But what exactly did you see? Chapter 3. Guests with faces like masks. The drawing room, late that afternoon, bore the air of a theater before curtain rise. Shadows stretched long across the parquet floors as the guests assembled, not by invitation, but by compulsion, each sensing that Poirot's arrival marked a shift in balance, an invisible line redrawn between the living and the dead. They were seated across two velvet divans, facing each other like rivals in a court of memory. Poirot entered without fanfare. He moved deliberately, eyes alert beneath the soft brim of his hat. Hastings was not with him this time, and so the silence felt more surgical, like a scalpel poised above exposed nerves. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said, taking a place near the fireplace, "I thank you for your time. This is not yet the interrogation. No, not yet. This is merely a conversation." Marc Delafosse smirked. "Do we get to choose our own masks, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but monsieur, I'm rather more interested in the ones you wear unknowingly." There was a pause, polite and brittle. Poirot gestured toward the footman, who brought in a silver tray of hot drinks. Chamomile, laced with honey. No wine, no cognac, no risk. He took his time, studied them as they sipped. Lord Chatham sat erect, his hands perfectly still. The diplomat's gaze, cool and measured, slid over the room like a ledger tallying risk. Poirot noted the rhythmic clench of his jaw, subtle but precise. The man was containing something. Beside him, Madame Giselle Fontaine leaned back, eyes closed behind dark glasses. Though blind, she moved with eerie certainty, like someone who tracked sound and hesitation more sharply than most did sight. Next to her sat Alaric Ventnor, nursing his wounded forearm. The bandage was fresh. His expression was sour. "I assume," he muttered, "you're going to ask us all where we were when the old girl dropped dead." Poirot gave him a patient look. "Eventually. But first, monsieur, I would rather understand your feelings toward the old girl, as you call her." Ventnor scoffed. "Célestine was a scholar, terribly intelligent, bit obsessed with minutiae, if you ask me. Once lectured me for half an hour on the origin of a Byzantine cross. I didn't dislike her. She wasn't interesting enough to dislike." Poirot said, eyes narrowing. "Not interesting enough. Curious. That is not the impression she left on others." He turned. "Madame Duval, what about you?" Livia Duval's eyes were framed by lashes like painted fans. She wore a shawl of deep plum and a perfume that lingered behind her like prophecy. "I found her very sharp," she said, her voice husky, deliberate, "and frightened. She sat in on my séance 3 nights ago, though she claimed to disapprove. But her hands trembled the whole time. I believe Célestine feared something was about to return, something from the past." "Did she say what?" "No," Livia said, "but after the session, she asked me a peculiar question." Poirot leaned in. Which was, do you believe the past can embed itself into objects, into glass, and if so, can it be awakened? The room fell briefly silent. Even the fire seemed to withhold its crackle. Poirot turned his gaze toward the last guest, Marc Delafosse, lean, elegant, and exquisitely evasive. And you, monsieur? I had dinner with her the night before, Marc said, reclining a little. We spoke of Edouard. Her devotion to him bordered on the saintly, and of the swan. She said she believed it had been intentionally hidden. Poirot's eyes sparkled. Hidden? Marc nodded. She thought it had been taken from a private collector who had reason to make it disappear. She said its reappearance was no coincidence. And did you believe her? I believe, Marc said slowly, that people often tell stories to protect the uglier truth beneath. Poirot made a small, satisfied sound. Just then, the door opened, and Delphine entered. All rose, instinctively. She looked more composed now, in mourning black, with an ivory brooch at her throat shaped like a moth. Her eyes went briefly to Poirot before settling on the others. I hope you have all made yourselves comfortable, she said coldly. If any of you are innocent, I suggest you remain so. Monsieur Poirot is very good at detecting the opposite. And then she left, as quickly as she had come. When the door closed, Lord Chatham finally spoke. What exactly are you suggesting, Poirot? His voice was even. That one of us murdered Madame Charon? For what? A pile of glass shards? Poirot straightened, his voice still quiet. I suggest only this, milord, that the swan shattered, and so did a life. That coincidence, while charming, is rarely honest, and that each of you in your way feared Madame Charon. He stood. Tomorrow, I will begin formal interviews. For tonight, I wish you restful dreams, though I fear most of you will not find them. Chapter 4. The Veins Within the Glass. At precisely 9 o'clock the next morning, Poirot sat at the small writing table in his appointed suite, a cup of perfectly sugared chocolate cooling beside a notepad. Outside, the snow had thickened its grip on the grounds, muffling footsteps and sharpening silence. The chateau seemed to crouch beneath it, like a cathedral waiting for confession. On the table before him lay 3 items. First, the sliver of glass he had recovered from the Mosaic room. Second, the unfinished letter from Madame Charon. And third, a copy of the guest book Delphine had reluctantly allowed him to examine. Each object, to Poirot, held the echo of a voice. Glass, he murmured, turning the shard slowly between his fingers, is not mute. It remembers how it was broken. His gaze flicked to the handwriting in the letter. Not hurried, not panicked, measured, confidence. She had not written it in fear, but in certainty. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The steward appeared. Monsieur Poirot, Madame Giselle is ready for her interview. Excellent, Poirot said, rising. Show her in. She entered with grace that seemed instinctive. A wool cloak framed her narrow shoulders, and her cane tapped gently as she crossed the room. Her eyes, though hidden behind smoked glasses, scanned her surroundings with the sensitivity of a bat in a cave. Madame, Poirot greeted her warmly. It is good of you to join me. Detective, she said, voice soft and precise. I assume you intend to ask me whether I heard anything unusual. I was hoping you might have. Even the silence, madam. It has shape, no? She smiled faintly. On the night of the accident, I sat in my room with the windows cracked open. The snow was light then. I could hear the wind shift. And did it bring voices? No voices, she said, shaking her head. But at around 10:30, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate. 2 sets, overlapping. One pair is lighter than the other. They paused near my door. One set walked toward the guest wing, the other back toward the Mosaic room. Poirot's brow lifted. "You're certain of this?" "I have spent my life listening," she replied coolly. "When you cannot rely on your eyes, you learn to hear guilt in the cadence of a breath." He leaned forward. "Madame Charon, did you feel she was afraid of someone in particular?" She hesitated. "I believe she feared many things, but she despised only one: hypocrisy. She was watching someone closely." Poirot tilted his head. "Whom?" "I do not know," Giselle said. "But she began humming again, 2 days before she died." "Humming?" "A melody I'd never heard from her before. Soft, repetitive. I believe it came from a place of remembering." Poirot sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. Then he said, "And what of the sculpture? What did you make of it?" Giselle was quiet. "I am blind, Monsieur Poirot, but I asked Marc Delafosse to describe it to me, every curve, every feather. He told me it shimmered like it was made of frozen light, and I asked him, was it perfect? And what did he say?" He hesitated. Then he said yes. "Too quickly?" "Far too quickly," she said. Poirot smiled. "Merci, madame. You have been most helpful." She rose, nodded, and swept out of the room. Later that morning, Poirot made his way again to the Mosaic room. It had been partially cleared, though a rope still kept the broken glass pedestal untouched. A wintry light streamed through the remains of the skylight above, illuminating the bare floor where the sculpture had once stood. But Poirot wasn't looking at the pedestal. He was studying the mosaic tiles beneath it. He knelt, ran a gloved hand over the surface. One tile, among hundreds, bore a faint scarring at its edge. Not from falling glass, but from something deliberate. A tool. A knife? He reached into his coat and withdrew the shard once more. When he held it over the tile, the light struck it at an angle that caused it to shimmer. Not just with color, but with faint markings, tiny lines, like veins. Not part of the swan's design, but perhaps part of a message? Poirot stood, suddenly alert. He now suspected the sculpture had not been entirely ornamental. It had been altered, embedded with something. A cipher, a warning, a confession. A new hypothesis began forming. Someone had reason to fear that the swan, long thought lost, would reveal something they could not afford to see resurface. Madame Charon had known. She had understood what was hidden in the glass, and that knowledge had signed her death warrant. Poirot murmured aloud, as if to the broken pedestal itself, "It was not vanity that killed you, chère madame. It was a vision, and someone else here has none at all, save for the fear of being seen." Chapter 5. The Man Who Smiled. Too soon, Poirot never trusted the man who smiled before the question was asked. Marc Delafosse arrived for his interview precisely on time, dressed in a pearl-grey jacket with an ascot that hinted more at theatre than mourning. His shoes gleamed, his cufflinks bore the Breval family crest, striking since he was not born a Breval. "I must say, Poirot," he said, sliding comfortably into the armchair, "it's refreshing to be questioned by someone with such taste in wallpaper. Far better than those sweating little inspectors with their bitten fingernails." Poirot offered a thin smile. "I regret to inform you, monsieur, I have never solved a case by the pattern on the walls." "No. Pity," Marc grinned. "Now, shall we talk of Celestine?" "We shall," Poirot said, clasping his hands. "You were close with her." "In a manner of speaking. She was loyal to Edouard, and I respected that. Her presence was, how shall I say, stabilizing. Old world, necessary even." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet you say it with a certain weariness." Marc exhaled, eyes sparkling. "She had a way of speaking in riddles, like a librarian who knows you'll never truly understand the book she's letting you borrow. Frankly, she unnerved me sometimes." Poirot did not write that down. He simply noted how easily the man smiled again, deflection cloaked in charm. "You dined with her the night before she died," Poirot said. "Tell me about that conversation." Mark's eyes flickered, just for a moment. She was subdued. She brought up Edouard's will, said it had been amended, though she hadn't seen the final draft. Something about a request to an unnamed recipient. Poirot lifted a brow. Unnamed? She said the details were missing. She suspected foul play. I told her she was being overly dramatic. And she accepted that? Mark leaned back, spreading his hands. She wasn't easily persuaded, but she didn't push. Instead, she asked me about the glass swan. What did you say? I told her the truth, that it was beautiful, exquisite, priceless, but not perfect. The words hung between them like a thread. Mark's smile held. I don't recall saying that. No, Poirot said mildly. Madame Fontaine does. Mark's eyes narrowed just slightly. She's blind. Precisely, Poirot said, and yet she sees very well. There was a pause. Poirot pressed forward. Tell me, monsieur, how the swan came to be in your possession. Mark didn't answer at first. He adjusted his cuffs. When he finally spoke, his voice was smoother than before. Too smooth. I received it from a private collector in Mykonos. It had been in fragments. I arranged its restoration through a conservator in Florence. No provenance papers, of course. It was smuggled out of Thessalonica decades ago, but Lady Delphine was determined to return it to the public eye. Poirot frowned. And this collector's name? Mark gave a small, regretful smile. I was never told. The deal was discreet. Paid in cryptocurrency, actually. Very modern. How convenient. You suspect me of something? Mark asked lightly, though the edge had crept into his voice. I suspect, Poirot said softly, that you are too well rehearsed, monsieur. That you had your story prepared before Madame Charon died, and yet something has unsettled you. Something has changed. Mark stood abruptly, straightening his lapels. You're fishing, Poirot. I've seen men like you before. You think everyone's hiding something, because you'd be nothing if they weren't. Poirot did not rise. But, monsieur, everyone is hiding something. That is not cynicism. That is humanity. Mark stared at him, then gave a short laugh, one without humor. You'll see, Poirot. You'll see ghosts in the wallpaper if you look long enough. He left without waiting to be dismissed. Alone once more, Poirot opened his notebook and underlined a name, Marc Delafosse, and beneath it, a single line. Too much charm is a mask. The question is, what lies beneath? Ambition, guilt, or fear? He returned to the guest book and flipped to the page where each arrival had signed their name 3 days earlier. He ran his finger down the list. There, Marc Delafosse's signature. Just above it, Célestine Charon. And above hers, someone else's, signed in the narrow, slanted hand of a person not yet questioned, Lord Howard Chatham. Poirot stared at it thoughtfully. A diplomat, yes, but also a strategist, cold, measured, and according to Giselle, awake the night Célestine died. The man had said little, but silence, in Poirot's experience, was rarely idle. Poirot closed his notebook. It was time to speak with the man who hadn't smiled at all. Chapter 6. The Language of Stillness. Lord Howard Chatham stood by the drawing-room window, unmoving, hands clasped neatly behind his back. The snow outside had begun to fall again, soft and persistent, blanketing the slopes of the estate in a hush that mirrored the atmosphere within. Poirot entered without ceremony, pausing just within the threshold. Monsieur Chatham, he said gently, might we speak? The diplomat did not turn. You may speak, Monsieur Poirot. Whether I choose to answer remains, as ever, my prerogative. Poirot walked further in, the click of his shoes the only interruption to the room's sepulchral stillness. There is, perhaps, some benefit in silence, but it cannot be relied upon forever. Chatham finally turned. His gaze was steady, sharp, and somehow weary. "You believe I am withholding something of value to your investigation?" "I believe you are withholding something," Poirot replied. "Its value we shall determine together." Chatham gestured to a nearby chair. "Then let us determine it quickly. I dislike the sensation of being watched." Poirot sat, folding his hands neatly in his lap. "Let us begin with the obvious. You were near the Mosaic room when the skylight fell." "I was," Chatham confirmed, unbothered. "I had stepped out to take a call from London. I heard the crash. I returned." "Convenient," Poirot murmured, "but it places you with no alibi at the moment the sculpture shattered." Chatham's lips twitched. "I am a diplomat, Monsieur Poirot. I am well accustomed to standing alone." Poirot let the moment breathe. "You knew Madame Charon from years ago," he said. "I did," Chatham nodded. "She worked in the French archives when I was stationed at the Geneva Council. She assisted in the authentication of certain recovered artifacts following the Balkan seizures." "Then you were aware of her connection to the glass swan?" "To an extent," Chatham replied. "She believed the sculpture had been misidentified, that its restoration was at best flawed and at worst fraudulent." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Did she confide this in you during her final evening?" "No," Chatham said slowly. "But she looked as if she wanted to. She stood in the hall after dinner, clutching that strange black folio she always carried. She looked at me, and then she turned away." Poirot leaned forward. "What do you think made her retreat?" Chatham's mouth thinned. "Perhaps she sensed what I did, that we were not alone in the corridor." Poirot sat back. "Ah, you believe you were watched?" "I do not believe, monsieur. I know. The scent of cigar smoke lingered. Alaric's brand, and the fire in the east hallway had just been stirred. Someone had been listening." Poirot nodded, eyes narrowing. "Madame Charon died hours later?" "Yes," Chatham replied, finally lowering himself into a chair. "And whatever she intended to reveal died with her." The fire crackled softly. Poirot's tone grew gentler. "Monsieur Chatham, you do not strike me as a man easily shaken, and yet you are perturbed." Chatham closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something beneath the iron had softened. "Edouard Breval," he said slowly, "was not merely a financier. During his final years, he dealt in clandestine transactions. Art, yes, but also influence and secrets." Poirot waited. "I was one of the few who negotiated with him on behalf of the Crown. I believed his motives were opaque, but aligned with Western interests." Poirot nodded. "Until they were not?" Chatham gave a single, cold laugh. "Until the week before his death. A document appeared, a ledger, names, symbols, codes, the sort of thing that could destroy reputations across 3 governments. And Madame Charon knew of it." "She did more than I know," Chatham said grimly. "She protected it. She told Edouard's widow that she burned it. I do not believe that was true." Poirot felt the air shift. A deeper current had been uncovered. "And you think someone wanted it? Enough to kill?" "I think," Chatham said, rising once again, "that there are games being played in this house far more dangerous than your sculpture." Poirot stood as well. "And what of the glass swan, monsieur? Do you still believe it is genuine?" Chatham turned his back to the window once more. "I believe it is cursed," he said, voice low, "and I believe the curse has nothing to do with ancient Greece." As Poirot left the drawing room, his mind hummed with tension. A forged sculpture, a vanished document. a historian silenced, and 6 guests, each with a motive too carefully concealed. He glanced out the hallway window at the courtyard below. There stood Livia Duval, alone in the snow, her face tilted toward the sky. She was murmuring to something Poirot could not see. Chapter 7. Séance in the Ice Garden. The garden behind Château d'Elegance, once a haven of sculpted roses and marble benches, now slept beneath a quilt of snow. Yet in the heart of that frozen hush, a small circle had been cleared, 5 chairs arranged around a wrought iron table, their legs half buried in the frost. Poirot watched from a second-floor window, arms folded neatly, as Livia Duval moved like a dancer around the makeshift ring. Her plum shawl flowed behind her like an unanswered question. In her hands, she held 3 small candles, which she lit one by one and placed at the triangle's corners. The flames guttered in the wind, but did not go out. When Poirot descended and stepped into the clearing, she greeted him without turning. "I wondered when you would come," she said, her voice carried by the quiet. "I am often drawn to the unusual," Poirot replied, adjusting his scarf, "and I was told you only perform séances indoors." Livia smiled faintly. "Indoors, the spirits hide. But in the cold, they speak more freely." "Do they?" Poirot moved closer, his eyes scanning the setup. "And what do they say about Madame Charon?" "She lingers," Livia said, sitting with slow grace. "But she is not peaceful." Poirot remained standing. "You knew her well." "We shared a few words," Livia said. "But I watched her. Celestine walked like someone carrying a glass jar inside her chest, afraid it might crack. Secrets ferment like wine, Monsieur Poirot. She was drunk with one." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You believe she was deliberately silenced?" "I believe," Livia said slowly, "that someone feared what she had already revealed. And I believe the swan was not the only fragile thing in this house." The wind whistled softly through the birch trees lining the perimeter. Poirot drew his coat tighter. "What did you see the night she died?" Livia paused. "I saw a shadow at her window," she said. "Tall. Male. It passed across the curtain just after 10, and then, 10 minutes later, a soft light, candlelight, faint, like someone searching through papers." "Could you identify the figure?" She shook her head. "Too far, but the movement, it was deliberate." "Not a thief, not a lover." Poirot's brow furrowed. "What else?" Livia glanced toward the sky, then lowered her voice. "That same night, I found something by the gate." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a small, frost-dusted object wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Poirot. He unfolded the fabric carefully. It was a chess piece, a white bishop, beautifully carved from ivory. "Where exactly did you find it?" he asked. "Just beyond the rose arch," she said. "Buried in the snow. It didn't belong there." Poirot studied it with care. The underside was inscribed faintly, "La vérité dans le silence." Truth lies in silence. He turned the piece slowly. The carving style. Familiar. The bishop's mitre was unusually sharp, its base hollowed out. Not decorative, Poirot realized. It once held something. A scroll, a fragment, a message. He looked up. "You did not tell anyone?" Livia smiled. "No one asks the medium about the tangible." Poirot returned the chess piece to its cloth and placed it carefully in his coat. "You are not like the others," he said. "Because I speak to the dead?" "No," Poirot said, "because you do not lie with your eyes." Livia looked at him for a long moment. Then she whispered, "But I still hide." Poirot gave a small bow. "As do we all." He turned back toward the chateau. Snow began to fall again, heavier now and sharp-edged. As he walked, he considered the piece in his pocket. A hollow bishop, a message disguised within a game of strategy. And Celestine, keeper of the truth, had been the queen removed. but who had moved the first piece. Back inside, Poirot returned to his suite and opened the small leather journal he'd begun since arriving. He turned to a blank page. Clues gathered, broken skylight with etching, Madame Charon's letter mentioning confession. The swan may contain hidden markings, veins. Marc Delafosse, Marc-Sand, too rehearsed. Lord Chatham, diplomatic secrets, concealed ledger. Giselle, footsteps in corridor. Livia, shadow at window. Bishop with inscription, Iswa, Alaric Venter. Rough edges, mask precision. Watch closely. Poirot tapped the end of his pen thoughtfully. There was a pattern emerging. Not of who struck, but of who feared the truth being restored. One death, one shattered sculpture, and a spiral of hidden knowledge that threatened to consume them all. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the stained glass window just slightly, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Chapter 8. What the Swan Carried. The shard lay cradled in Poirot's gloved hand, slick with condensation. Even by candlelight, its strange geometry hinted at something older than art. Something encoded. He held it up and studied the delicate line of numbers etched faintly within. Latitudes, mes amis, he whispered, or longitudes. These are not the idle scratches of a sculptor. They are instructions, directions. The others had followed him back into the mosaic room in tense silence. Lord Chatham leaned heavily on his cane, peering toward the unconscious form of Lady Delphine now resting on a velvet settee beneath a silk throw. Livia Duval, pale beneath her dark lipstick, kept glancing at the shard, her expression caught between awe and dread. Marc Delafosse broke the silence. "You think the sculpture was a map?" Poirot turned toward him, one eyebrow rising like the slow movement of a chess piece. "Not the sculpture, monsieur. The fragments of it, each a part of something whole. Madame Charon found one. Now we have another, and I believe there is at least a third, perhaps more." Marc stepped closer. "But why hide a map inside art?" "Because the swan is not simply an object d'art. It is a cipher, a vessel designed by someone who wishes to conceal something of value. Perhaps knowledge, perhaps an artifact, perhaps a place." Alaric Ventnor gave a sharp scoff. "So now we're hunting treasure?" "Non, monsieur. We are tracing a motive," Poirot replied coolly. "For a woman has been killed, and another nearly silenced." Lord Chatham stirred at last, clearing his throat. "The swan," he said slowly, "was once in the royal collection. If memory serves, it belonged to a minor Habsburg collector during the 1800s. It vanished during the upheavals of 1848. Rumor had it that it was created during the Napoleonic exiles, smuggled out of France with secrets Napoleon scholars uncovered in Egypt." "Indeed," Poirot nodded. "I came across similar lore in my reading, and the structure of the shards, they reflect non-Euclidean angles, not natural to mere ornamentation." Alaric folded his arms. "We're chasing ghosts." Giselle Fontaine, still standing near the shattered pedestal, spoke softly. "You do not understand the kinds of secrets people preserve across generations, monsieur. Some things, forgotten cities, lost sciences, are not meant to remain visible. They endure only by being buried in plain sight." Poirot turned to her. "You know something, Madame Fontaine." Her face betrayed no emotion. Only that Madame Charon was desperate to find the full swan, that she felt time pressing against her, and she said something strange 2 nights before she died. He leaned closer. "What did she say?" Giselle hesitated, her gloved fingers tightening on the head of her cane. "She said the swan was returning to the water, that once it did, the glass would open again." The room fell into a hush. "Water," Livia murmured. "There's a hidden cove beneath this estate, the Grotto Pool. The servants say it was built centuries ago, long before the chateau was finished." Poirot's eyes lit with sudden clarity. Then that, mademoiselle, is where we shall go. At once. The path to the grotto was a narrow one, descending by torchlight through a side passage lined with rough-hewn stone. Yvette, at Poirot's request, unlocked the rusted iron gate at the bottom, revealing a cavern choked with sea air and salt. The torchlight flickered across still water, a round pool sunk into the limestone, ringed by forgotten steps. It was silent save for the gentle lapping of the tide against the rocks. Poirot held the shard over the pool. "This place," he said, "was no ordinary storage chamber. Look at the symmetry, the acoustics, the alignment of the columns to the northern opening. The Swan was always meant to return here." Livia stepped forward. "What are you saying?" "That this," he said, voice rising gently, "was the cradle of the cipher. The coordinates etched into the shards, they may not point outward, but inward. Each angle, each etching, reveals a spatial relationship, a constellation of sorts, designed to be revealed only when the fragments are brought together in this very chamber." He dropped to one knee and placed the shard into a recessed groove along the base of a ruined statue by the pool's edge. It clicked softly. A mechanism hummed. A panel in the wall slid open with a groan of ancient stone. Beyond it, a narrow corridor, black as pitch. Poirot turned, expression grave. "Now, we walk toward what the Swan has carried all this time. But take care, mes amis. The killer, too, may be watching, for what lies beyond this door may be worth a second death." Chapter 9. The Corridor of Salt and Secrets. The air inside the corridor was colder than the grotto itself, sharp with the scent of seawater and stone dust. Poirot stepped carefully, his polished shoes whispering against uneven limestone. Behind him came Livia, her shawl pulled close, then Alaric Ventnor, Marc Delafosse, Giselle Fontaine, and Lord Chatham, each carrying a lantern retrieved from the grotto wall. The flame-lit procession moved slowly, as if descending into an ancient tomb. The passage narrowed, forcing them into single file. Faint inscriptions lined the walls, symbols that resembled both star maps and alchemical diagrams, etched in deliberate precision. Marc's voice came from behind Poirot, hushed. "This place predates the chateau." "Oui," Poirot replied. "It predates even the Napoleonic era. It may be older than any of us were meant to witness." Livia ran her fingers over the markings. "These are not European." "No," said Giselle quietly. "They're Proto-Berber. Prehistoric desert glyphs, moved from Africa, perhaps. Smuggled, repurposed." Poirot's brow furrowed. Madame Charron was searching for something hidden beneath the language of art, a knowledge encoded in layers, like this corridor. As above, so below. Suddenly, the group reached a small landing where the corridor forked. One path veered sharply downward, the other, narrower, curved to the right and glimmered faintly. Poirot paused. "We divide." "Dangerous," said Lord Chatham. "We should stay together." "Non," Poirot said gently. "Too many footsteps will erase fragile evidence. Monsieur Ventnor, Giselle, you will take the lower passage. Observe, do not touch. The rest with me." Alaric grunted but obeyed, leading Giselle down into shadow. Poirot turned and led the others toward the narrow, glimmering path. The walls here shimmered faintly with calcite, and ancient marine fossils jutted from the stone like buried runes. After 20 paces, the passage opened into a domed chamber, round, low-ceilinged, and lined with niches containing small glass artifacts. Livia gasped. "It's a vault." "Indeed," Poirot whispered. The chamber's centerpiece was a circular dais carved from black granite. Upon it stood a pedestal of rough iron, rusted but intact. On top of this, resting as though untouched for centuries, was the third shard of the Swan. It gleamed with a deep iridescence, as if it remembered light. Poirot stepped forward and lifted it. This one was triangular, slightly curved, with its etching forming part of a spiral. He rotated it slowly. At its center was a name, Clermont-Navarre, 1811. Livia's voice trembled. Navarre, a cartographer from Napoleon's Egyptian expeditions. I studied his maps. He disappeared in Alexandria. Poirot turned to her, eyes gleaming. Not disappeared, hidden, as was his knowledge. He carefully wrapped the shard in a silk cloth and placed it into his coat. Suddenly, a distant cry echoed through the corridor, the unmistakable sound of distress. Mark drew his lantern high. That came from the lower passage. They rushed back, retracing their steps. The air had thickened, the silence replaced by a low tremor in the stone itself. As they rounded the bend into the lower corridor, Poirot halted. At the base of the steps, Giselle Fontaine stood alone, her cane planted firmly, her face ghost-white. "Where is Monsieur Whodunit?" Poirot asked. She raised her chin slowly. "He vanished," she said. "What?" "We found a sealed chamber, carvings covered in tar. As we studied it, he stepped forward, and the floor opened. A trapdoor. He dropped before I could cry out." Poirot rushed forward to the indicated space. Sure enough, the stone tiles bore faint hinge marks. The mechanism was old, triggered by weight, cleverly hidden. A defense, or perhaps a filter. "How deep?" Mark asked. "I couldn't hear him land," Giselle murmured. "There was only silence." Poirot knelt, then stood again. "We must assume Monsieur Whodunit is alive, but we cannot assist him without endangering ourselves." Livia stared at the ground. "Do you believe it was an accident?" Poirot's face was unreadable. "I believe that Monsieur Whodunit knew more than he admitted, and that the swan guards its final secrets as fiercely as those who seek to possess it." He looked back at the others. "We return, before we too are swallowed." Back in the grotto, the group emerged from the corridor, dirt-streaked, shaken, but carrying the third shard. Poirot placed all 3 fragments atop the velvet-covered table and studied them under lantern light. The etchings, once disjointed, now aligned, forming a star pattern over a cluster of latitude and longitude coordinates. Livia gasped. "That's the island of Sormieu, near Marseille. There's a system of caves, underwater passages, ancient." Then, Poirot said softly, "The final truth does not lie here. It lies buried in the deep." Lord Chatham looked stunned. "We leave the chateau." Poirot nodded. "Tomorrow. The truth will not wait, and our killer grows impatient." He leaned in, fingers tapping the spiral on the third shard. Madame Charon died for this knowledge. The swan did not carry art, it carried memory, secrets best left undisturbed. But someone disturbed them, and now I fear they will kill again. Chapter 10. The Depths That Whisper. Names the following morning broke with a subdued, heavy mist clinging to the chateau's stone terraces. The Mediterranean beyond lay still, almost solemn, as if bracing for what was to come. Poirot stood by the window of the drawing-room, sipping strong coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him, the others gathered in hushed anticipation. Livia Charon, her scarf tied tight against her neck, pale but resolute. Giselle Fontaine, silent and unshaken after the previous night's ordeal. Mark Delafosse, flicking through a stack of marine maps with sudden, uncharacteristic precision, and Lord Chatham, ever fidgeting, his gaze shifting nervously from Poirot to the ticking carriage clock on the mantel. "Monsieur Poirot," Chatham said at last, clearing his throat, "are we truly to descend into a cave beneath the sea? Is it not rather theatrical?" Poirot turned with a flicker of amusement. "Mais non, Lord Chatham. It is not theatrics, it is a destination. The swan's trail has led us to Sormieu. A cartographer from Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, a trapdoor in an ancient corridor, and 3 fragments of an enigma. What more proof is required that the final revelation rests in that submerged crypt? Mark interjected, spreading a map across the table. I've identified the coordinates from the 3rd shard. They correspond exactly with an underwater gallery near Cap Sormu, part of the Cosca cave system, but access requires diving. The entrance is nearly 30 meters below the surface. Poirot nodded gravely. Then we descend. By midday, they stood at the rocky inlet of Sormu, the cliffs around them carved by centuries of wind and tide. The small motorboat Mark had secured rocked gently as wetsuits were unpacked, oxygen tanks checked, and waterproof lanterns tested. Only 3 would dive: Poirot, Mark, and Livia. Giselle remained at the shore, sighting her leg. Lord Chatham abstained as well, uneasy with the idea of submerged ruins. He offered to act as a lookout. Poirot, now donning a wetsuit tailored to fit over his shirt and tie, addressed the 2 chosen companions. We go not merely in search of relics, but of truth. And truth, mes amis, often lies beneath fear. Mark led the descent, guiding them with the calm of a practiced diver. The water swallowed them quickly, muffling all sound but their breath. Blue gave way to darkness as the light of day vanished above. After several tense minutes, they reached a narrow aperture carved into the cliffside, barely wide enough for a single person to slip through. Inside, the Cosca cave opened up, a labyrinth of submerged chambers, ancient paintings, and calcified time. They moved through with care, Poirot noting every marking, every symbol that repeated the motifs on the swan's fragments, spirals, celestial maps, even what appeared to be stylized birds with outstretched wings. Finally, they emerged into a partially air-filled cavern, a place where the ceiling curved above them like a cathedral, shimmering with condensation. In the center stood a monolith. Not natural, man-made. A black stone pillar, square-edged, carved with the exact swan insignia, though not as an emblem of a ship, but as a glyph, a language, a symbol of transition between earth and memory. Livia surfaced beside Poirot, breathing hard. This is it. Poirot approached the pillar and, with care, retrieved the fragments from his waterproof satchel. He assembled them, 2 curved edges and the spiraled 3rd, pressing them gently against a recess at the top of the stone. With a soft click, they sank into place. A deep grinding echoed through the cavern. Beneath their feet, the floor trembled. Then, a hidden compartment slid open in the base of the monolith, revealing a sealed copper scroll case, its surface engraved with the name Charon, L, 1903. Livia stared. My grandfather. Poirot took the scroll with reverence. Your family were the final guardians. This was no mere collection of stolen art. The swan transported knowledge, a lineage of preservation, of hidden wisdom. Suddenly, the waters behind them stirred. Mark turned sharply. Someone's coming. A second figure emerged from the darkness, diving mask glinting, but as it surfaced, it was not a diver. It was Alaric Ventnor, alive, barely breathing, blood streaming from a wound at his forehead. He grasped the rock, pulled off his mask. They tried to drown me, he gasped. It was her. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Her? But Ventnor collapsed before he could say more. They had no choice but to retreat. Back at the chateau, Ventnor was placed under medical care. Poirot sat in the library beside Livia and Giselle, the scroll case unopened on the desk between them. No more secrets, Livia whispered. No more lies. Poirot nodded solemnly. Indeed, mademoiselle, and now at last the swan speaks. Chapter 11. The Scroll of Charon. Evening had settled heavily over the chateau, the last crimson sliver of sunlight swallowed by the Mediterranean. Inside the study, Hercule Poirot sat with precision at the broad mahogany desk, flanked by Livia and Giselle. The copper scroll case lay before them like an unearthed relic from myth, cold and silent. Alaric Ventnor remained unconscious upstairs, a doctor summoned from Marseille tending to his wounds. Lord Chatham paced restlessly in the drawing-room, his whiskey untouched. Poirot's gloved fingers examined the scroll's etchings one last time. The name engraved, Sharon L. This is not merely a signature. It is a cipher, a seal. Livia leaned forward, her face unreadable in the golden lamplight. My grandfather kept notebooks, journals, but none ever mentioned this. Non, Poirot said, because this was never meant for the world above. This scroll was buried beneath tide and time, intended only for the moment when all paths converge. Like now. With delicate motion, he twisted the cap and drew out a tightly coiled parchment, brittle but intact. He unrolled it slowly. What emerged was a series of codes, diagrams, and symbols. Not simply a list of stolen art, as many had believed, but a map of transactions dating back decades. Across Europe and North Africa, lines connected art pieces to names, some dead, some living. At the center, written in a looping hand, Le cygne portera la mémoire. The swan shall carry the memory. Poirot's eyes narrowed. It was never a smuggling vessel. It was an ark, a floating archive of stolen memory, paintings, manuscripts, relics, all moved under the guise of looting, but in truth, preserved by a hidden order. Livia was silent. Then she whispered, "The Order of the Swan." "We," Poirot said, "not thieves, but curators of what war would have destroyed. Yet someone, perhaps many, coveted it for power rather than preservation." Giselle now spoke, her voice sharp but poised. "Then who betrayed the order? Who attacked Ventnor? Who killed Leclerc?" Poirot rose slowly, pacing toward the hearth. "Ah, madam, that is where the mystery breathes. Ventnor was no thief. He was the courier of information, a man seeking redemption. The fragments were never intended for sale. He was reconstructing something sacred, not lucrative." "But why fake his death?" Livia asked. "He did not fake it," Poirot said. "Someone tried to murder him and make it look like he vanished. He survived by fortune, not design." The door creaked. Marc Delafosse entered, wiping seawater from his neck. He looked shaken. "I checked the dive logs from the boat rental. One tank is missing. Someone followed us into the water. Someone with access." Poirot turned to him slowly. "And who had that access, mon ami?" Marc hesitated. "Only me. Chatham and—" He trailed off. "Giselle," Poirot finished for him. All eyes turned. Giselle's brow arched, but her mouth remained calm. "I've never used a diving rig in my life," she said, standing, "and I remained here with Lord Chatham during the dive." "Ask him." "I shall," Poirot murmured. "But it is not only physical presence that matters. It is intention. Someone knew Ventnor was nearing the final truth. Someone feared what the scroll might reveal, and so they struck. Suddenly, the room was pierced by a shout from upstairs. Poirot, Marc, and the women rushed upward to find the doctor, his sleeves bloodied, standing at the threshold of the guest room. "He's conscious," he said breathlessly. "Barely. But he keeps saying the same thing." They entered. Ventnor lay on the bed, face pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He blinked open groggy eyes and saw Poirot. "She's not what she seems," he murmured. "Chatham's not the only one who knew about the cave." Poirot leaned closer. "Who, monsieur? Tell me." Ventnor's lips parted. "She wears the memory like a mask." Then he passed out again. Poirot stood, turning to the others. "It is time, mes amis. We gather everyone. Now." 10 minutes later, the entire group assembled in the drawing room. Livia, Mark, Giselle, and a visibly anxious Lord Chatham. Poirot stood at the center of the room, the scroll in his hands. "I have called you together because the hour is late, and the truth stands upon the threshold," Poirot began. "One of you walks among us not as a witness to history, but as its assassin." No one moved. Poirot continued, "We are not dealing with the theft of fortune, but of legacy. The Swan was not a smuggler's vessel. It was the guardian of culture stolen by empires, curated in silence. And now someone wishes to bury that memory forever." He stepped closer to the hearth. "I now know who killed Bertrand Leclerc, who tried to drown Alaric Ventnor, and who plans to silence the Swan, once and for all." His eyes swept the room. The fire cracked, and then Poirot spoke a name. Chapter 12. The Memory Wears a Mask. The room stood suspended in stillness, a breath before the plunge. Firelight flickered against the polished floor, casting long, ghost-like shadows that danced behind the assembled figures. Poirot's finger extended, not dramatically, but with the certainty of a man who had drawn the final thread from a tangled knot. Giselle Moreau. A soft gasp broke from Livia, but Giselle didn't flinch. Her expression remained composed, almost tranquil, as though she'd anticipated the accusation long before it was spoken aloud. Lord Chatham stepped back, his glass falling to the floor. Mark Delafosse's fists tightened at his sides. Poirot moved slowly, circling Giselle. "You wear refinement as one wears perfume, lightly but with purpose. You arrived under the pretext of investigating lost relics. But I found no correspondence from the university you claim to represent. No grant, no archive. Merely a name, one you assumed from a real scholar who died 2 years ago." Giselle gave him a long, appraising look, then tilted her head. "And yet you waited until now." "Ah," Poirot smiled sadly. "Because even I, madame, had to listen first to the rhythm of the lies, and yours beat in perfect tempo, until this evening." He gestured toward the scroll case. "The moment you saw the case, you knew it. You did not look at it as a discovery. You looked at it as a memory reclaimed. The Swan was no mystery to you. It was part of your inheritance." Her lips parted faintly, but she said nothing. Poirot continued, "You are not merely a historian. You are blood to the order. Charon was your grandfather." A hush swept the room. Giselle closed her eyes, and a long breath left her chest, like air escaping a vault long sealed. "Yes," she said softly, "but I never killed Leclerc." Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to the hearth and placed the scroll beside the fire, its delicate symbols shimmering. "You wanted the truth to be preserved. This, I believe. You infiltrated this group not for profit, but for protection. But someone else feared what you might uncover." Mark took a step forward. "So if it wasn't her, then who?" Poirot turned to the last man in the room. "Lord Chatham." The old aristocrat stiffened. "Preposterous," he barked. "I've been a patron of the arts longer than most of you have drawn breath. I invited Ventnor. I gave Giselle access." "Indeed," Poirot said. "And you also possessed knowledge of the shipwreck's coordinates before the archives were opened. You hired the original dive team that discovered the Swan 10 years ago, then had them dismissed when they found more than coins." The blood drained from Chatham's face. "You feared exposure," Poirot said. "Not because of theft, but because your family had long traded in the shadow market. For generations. Paintings removed from war zones, sculptures lifted from collapsing states. You were part of a quiet empire of cultural erasure. The Swan's emergence threatened to make all that public." Poirot stepped closer. "You stabbed Leclerc the night he confronted you in the garden. He'd begun decoding the fragments and realized the truth. The scroll would link your name to a ledger of historical crimes." Chatham's mouth twitched. "You have no proof." "I have the scroll," Poirot said. "And more importantly, I have Ventnor." who kept recordings, encrypted conversations. You did not know that, non? From the hallway, Inspector Lemoine entered, flanked by a uniformed gendarme. He nodded at Poirot and quietly approached Chatham. "I would advise you to say nothing further, milord," the inspector said. "We will speak on the drive to Marseille." Chatham's shoulders slumped. There was no grand outburst, no denial, only the silence of a man whose lineage had been carved into dust. As the gendarmes led him out, Giselle sat slowly, her fingers trembling. I thought it was Ventnor. I thought he betrayed my grandfather." Poirot nodded. "So you followed him, hoping to find proof. You never expected him to nearly die, nor that his enemy would strike again." Mark knelt beside her. "You could have told us." She gave a bitter smile. Would anyone have listened? A historian with no papers, no credentials. I wore the mask to get close. Poirot moved to the scroll once more. "And now, mademoiselle, you must decide what to do with what you've uncovered. Some truths are better preserved, others exposed, but all must be carried with care." Giselle looked at the parchment as if it weighed more than stone. "I'll take it to Venice," she whispered. "There's a private trust there. They keep what others would destroy." Poirot nodded. Outside, the night sighed through the trees, the wind heavy with the scent of salt and olive. The sea, just visible through the balcony windows, shimmered black and eternal. Somewhere beneath its surface, the remnants of the Swan lay once again undisturbed, its secrets now spoken, its burdens lifted. But Poirot, ever the student of the human soul, knew that memory, true memory, was never buried for long. Chapter 13. Beneath the olive grove. Morning rose slowly over the estate at Saint-Raphael, its light soft and honeyed as it filtered through the ancient olive trees. The leaves shimmered silver in the breeze, and from the terrace the sea could be heard murmuring as if sighing in relief. But within the manor, the atmosphere remained hushed, contemplative, like a chapel after a funeral. Poirot stood in the garden with his hands behind his back, gazing at the broken fountain in the courtyard. The headless cherub stared skyward, a relic of another age. He was not a sentimental man by nature, but something about this place stirred thoughts not only of crimes and puzzles, but of legacies, of the stories people chose to tell and those they buried in fear. Inspector Lemoine approached from the path, his boots crunching faintly on the gravel. "Chatham has been remanded to Marseille. The charges are being drawn. Art smuggling, fraud, obstruction of justice. But you were right about one thing." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "He will never stand trial," Lemoine said. "The family lawyers will bury this faster than any court can exhume it. He will fade into obscurity, with his fortune quietly absorbed into a dozen blind trusts." Poirot nodded slowly. "Oui. Some endings are not just, but they are complete." "And the girl?" Lemoine asked. "Giselle Moreau, if that is her name." "She has gone," Poirot said, eyes still fixed on the fountain. "Early this morning, she left a note offering no apology, no justification, only gratitude for silence." The inspector sighed. "So we are left with no murderer to hang, no medal to award, and no relics to recover. A curious case, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot smiled gently. "But one rich in truth, mon ami, and that is the rarest treasure of all." Inside the villa, Livia stood at the long dining table, absently twisting a spoon between her fingers. The heavy silence had become familiar, less oppressive now, but still present, like the last fading note of a haunting melody. Mark entered quietly, a stack of papers under his arm. "You're leaving?" she asked without turning. He hesitated. "I think we've both been living among shadows, Livia. Perhaps it's time we see daylight again." She looked at him then, and something passed between them, tentative, delicate. "I kept the letter," she said softly. "The one I found in Jean-Luc's drawer. I didn't understand it before." Mark set the papers down. "The one in Latin?" Livia nodded. "It wasn't just a fragment. It was a translation, a confession. Jean-Luc knew about Chatham. He wanted to expose it, but he feared what it would do to his family, to me. So he sent copies to contacts in the art world. One of them must have reached Giselle." Poirot entered the room, having heard enough from the doorway to piece together the final harmony of this discordant symphony. "Then Leclerc was not a traitor, but a protector," Poirot said. "He shielded the scroll not for profit, but to ensure it reached the right hands." Livia's eyes shimmered. "I accused him. I doubted him." "Do not grieve the doubt, madam," Poirot said gently. "Grieve only the silence that followed it." Mark looked toward the courtyard. "What will happen to the scroll now?" "Giselle will ensure it is studied. Not sold, not destroyed," Poirot replied. "In Venice, the trust she mentioned is overseen by a group of archivists who specialize in culturally endangered documents. It will remain there, safe from those who would twist it." Mark exhaled. "Then it ends." Poirot tilted his head. "No, it begins. For the truth, once set free, does not rest. It walks." Later that day, Poirot strolled once more beneath the olive grove, his polished shoes leaving no mark upon the soft ground. The trees swayed with secrets, their roots entwined with old stones, forgotten bones, and echoes of prayers once whispered by monks, sailors, and smugglers alike. He paused near the base of a crooked tree, where a rough stone cross stood half swallowed by moss. The inscription had long worn away, but he knelt briefly before it all the same. "Perhaps you were the first to die for the truth," he murmured, "or perhaps the last to be remembered." As the sun climbed higher, the air grew warmer. The light turned golden, casting no shadows. And Hercule Poirot, with his case concluded, his conscience quiet and his mind ever curious, turned toward the path that led down to the coast. He had no further need of relics or scrolls, only the understanding that the past, like an olive tree, may twist and darken with age, but it always bears fruit when tended with care. Chapter 14. The Child Who Drew the Truth. It was late afternoon when Hercule Poirot returned to the village of Saint-Raphael, the warm southern air humming with the distant calls of cicadas. The train back to Paris did not leave until morning, and he found himself wandering with no particular direction until he remembered a certain sketch, drawn with such innocence and disturbing precision, tucked into his valise like a ghost that refused to be forgotten. The child. Milo Rousseau. He was not merely a boy who had seen too much. He was a boy who had understood too much. Poirot made his way through the cobbled streets to the modest home of Madame Rousseau, the schoolteacher. Her shutters were open, flower boxes neatly tended, and the smell of freshly baked bread floated from the kitchen window. Madame Rousseau answered with mild surprise at the unexpected visit, but graciously invited him in. Milo sat at the table with a coloring book, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. Poirot smiled as he stepped in, his voice gentle. "Bonjour, mon petit artiste." Milo looked up, his eyes bright, but there was caution behind them, something more watchful than one might expect from a boy of 8. Poirot knelt beside him and laid a hand lightly on the table. "Do you remember the drawing you made for Mademoiselle Livia? Of the man with the red shoes near the wall?" Milo nodded solemnly. "I wasn't supposed to see him, but he was crying." Poirot's brow lifted. "Crying?" Milo flipped to a new page and began to sketch quickly, small hands surprisingly steady. Within a minute, he had drawn 2 figures, one large, one small, one kneeling, face hidden in his hands. The other was standing behind the wall, peeking. "That was you," Poirot murmured. Milo pointed. He dropped something. It made a noise, and then he said a bad word. Then he cried. He had a white scarf." Poirot's breath caught. "White, you say?" Milo nodded. It was not Chatham, not the silk-collared Englishman with his precise rage and tailored threats. Poirot leaned forward. "Tell me, mon cher, was it daytime or night?" Milo looked toward his mother, who gave an encouraging nod. "It was still light, but the sun was going down. I wasn't supposed to be out, but I forgot my ball." The boy's honesty was absolute. There was no embellishment, no fantasy in his tone, only the unfussy truth of a child who observed without agenda. Poirot turned to Madame Rousseau. "Did Milo tell anyone this before?" She shook her head. "I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was imagination. Children do that, you know, and there was already so much trouble at the villa." Poirot stood, thanking them both, and carefully folded the new sketch into his pocket. "Madame, your son may not know it, but he has given clarity to a very cloudy sky." Outside, as he walked away from the little house, Poirot reviewed the image now burned into his mind. A man in red shoes, a white scarf, kneeling, crying, at sunset, near the wall, before the body was ever discovered. Jean-Luc Leclerc had not died at the hands of a stranger. He had not been murdered for a relic. He had been weeping, alone, before death. Poirot knew now what had broken him. It was guilt, not guilt for keeping the scroll, but for something else, something that came before. And it was someone close, someone who wore a white scarf, someone who would weep at dusk in the olive grove, perhaps even speak to a brother who no longer answered. He walked faster, not toward the manor, but toward the little chapel near the cliffs. It had once served the monks, now long disbanded, and remained open to the public only on Sundays, but it held something Poirot needed: solitude and reflection. Within the cool stone walls of the chapel, Poirot sat quietly in the back pew, listening to the wind push against the stained glass windows. And then, softly, as if spoken aloud in the echoing silence of his mind, it was not the scroll that shattered the family, but the truth it represented. The truth no one wanted to see, until a child, with simple crayons and a clear conscience, drew what everyone else refused to accept. The case was not only about what was taken, it was about what was witnessed, and there was still one witness who had not yet spoken. Not the boy, not Giselle, not Livia, but someone who had hidden behind a veil of detachment and academia. Someone whose shoes had left no prints in the earth, but whose grief had bled into the soil all the same. Chapter 15. The Manuscript and the Mourner. By the time Hercule Poirot returned to the villa, the light had turned to a rose-colored haze across the Mediterranean, and a soft mistral wind stirred the branches of the cypress trees lining the estate. He walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, the boy's words circling his mind with quiet insistence. He dropped something. He cried. He had a white scarf. A man undone not by confrontation, but by inner torment. Poirot's steps took him not to the main house, but to the library outbuilding where the lights were still on. He knocked lightly on the door. It was Dr. Matthias Engel who answered, eyes blinking behind his spectacles. He looked worn, as if the weight of too many long days had finally begun to settle on his shoulders. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted. "Is it late already?" Poirot stepped inside, uninvited but with purposeful calm. Indeed. But as the old proverb goes, truth often arrives after supper. Engel gave a faint smile and gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "I assume you are not here for more folklore about Gnostic scrolls?" "No," Poirot said, lowering himself into the seat. "I am here for what you left out." The German scholar blinked. "Pardon? You have a remarkable command of ancient languages, Doctor, but your real fluency is in emotional detachment. That is what allowed you to carry on with your lectures, your cataloguing, even after Jean-Luc was found dead." Engel stiffened. "I was devastated." Poirot studied him. Yes, but quietly. As one who mourns in private, because to mourn publicly would mean to explain. A long silence followed. The wind pressed faintly against the windows, rattling them like distant fingers. Poirot reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, the latest of Milo's drawings. He laid it on the table between them. "Do you know what this is?" Engel leaned forward. It was the figure of a man kneeling, hands to his face, and near him, a boy watching. "The child drew this," Poirot said gently. "He saw someone crying near the wall the evening before the body was found. The man was wearing a white scarf." Engel's face paled. "That doesn't mean—" Poirot raised a hand. "Do not deny it, monsieur. Milo did not know who you were, but he remembers what he saw." Engel's voice was raw now. "Jean-Luc was my friend." "No," Poirot corrected softly. "He was your brother." The words hung like thunder between them. Engel exhaled sharply, as though the truth had been struck from his lungs. "We had different fathers. My mother was Swiss. He never acknowledged me, not formally, but when I came here 2 years ago to assist with his lectures, he embraced me." Poirot's voice was tender. "And then?" Engel leaned back, eyes distant. Then he changed. After he discovered the scroll, he withdrew, became suspicious, even paranoid. He spoke of curses, of ancestral sins. I thought it was nonsense, academic stress, but then I found the letter. Poirot leaned forward. "What letter?" Engel stood and opened a drawer behind him, removing a folded parchment, old but unsealed. He handed it to Poirot with trembling fingers. It was written in Jean-Luc's careful hand. "Matthias, if anything should happen to me, know that I never intended for this truth to destroy you. The scroll confirms what grandmother told me in secret, that the Leclerc name is not free of blood. There was a betrayal long ago. A brother sold another for coin to preserve the family's claim on this land. I had hoped we could share the burden, but I see now that some truths can only be carried by one." Poirot read it twice, slowly. He meant to shield you from the stain of their history. Engel sank into his chair. I confronted him. I was angry. I said cruel things, that he cared more for legends than for the living, that he was using the scroll to elevate himself. He didn't argue, he just wept. Then he left. Poirot closed the letter. "You followed him." Engel nodded, eyes shining now. "To the grove. He said he was going to hide the scroll again, that it didn't matter anymore. I told him he was a coward." He paused, swallowing. "He asked me to forgive him. Then he walked deeper into the grove. I didn't follow." Poirot's voice was low. "And you never saw him alive again?" "No." For a moment, neither spoke. Poirot stood, carefully folding the letter and handing it back. "Dr. Engel, you're not guilty of murder, but you are guilty of silence." Engel nodded, silent tears slipping down his cheeks. "I thought it would protect him, his legacy." Poirot looked to the window, to the darkening silhouette of the olive trees. "But the truth, doctor, it does not rot like fruit when it is buried. It grows." Chapter 16. The Echo in the Garden. The next morning arrived with uncharacteristic stillness, as if the villa itself sensed the nearing of some unspoken climax. Poirot stood at the window of his room, watching the crows scatter across the olive grove in tight spirals, their black shapes knifing through the golden light. He had not slept. Instead, he had sat at the desk all night, reviewing Milo's sketches, Engel's confession, the fragments of the ancient scroll, and, most curiously, the timetable of the evening when Jean-Luc Leclerc was last seen alive. Each piece hummed with resonance. But there was still something missing, something subtle, something silent. Poirot descended the stairs and stepped outside into the fresh morning air. The scent of thyme and sun-warmed stone greeted him. Near the southern side of the estate, the gardener, Alain, a wiry man with leathery skin, was trimming hedges near the old fountain. "Bonjour, Monsieur Poirot," Alain greeted, his shears pausing mid-cut. Poirot approached him slowly. "Ah, bonjour, my friend. May I trouble you with a small matter of curiosity?" Alain set down his tools. "Of course. You have tended these grounds for many years, yes?" 22, monsieur." "Then I ask, have the olive trees ever yielded fruit on the western slope?" Alain blinked, surprised. "Only sparsely. The soil there is shallow, but 3 trees by the stone bench still give olives." Poirot nodded. "And that bench? It is old. Very old. Jean-Luc brought it here from the monastery ruins near Saint-Remy." Poirot's eyes sparkled faintly. "Interesting. Did you notice any disturbance in that area the morning after Jean-Luc's disappearance?" Alain hesitated. "Only that a cluster of lavender had been trampled." "I thought it was a wild boar." Poirot smiled. "No, not a boar. A man, burdened not by tusks, but by fear." Leaving the gardener perplexed, Poirot made his way toward the grove, boots crunching softly over gravel. As he reached the secluded bench, he slowed his pace. The same lavender cluster remained flattened beneath dew-heavy footprints. Near it, nestled in the roots of one of the olive trees, was a small indent in the earth. Poirot knelt. His fingers brushed the dirt. Something had once been buried here, and not deeply. A handkerchief, a scroll, or perhaps something meant to disappear entirely. He rose and turned back toward the house, where voices carried faintly from the breakfast terrace. The professor's widow, Sylvie, sat sipping coffee with Nadine, the museum assistant. Their conversation ceased the moment they saw him approach. "Ladies," Poirot greeted politely. Nadine's smile was brittle. "You look like a man with answers, Monsieur Poirot." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm a man with many questions, and a few answers that I would rather not have." Sylvie placed her cup down, eyes wary. "Such as?" Poirot did not sit. "Such as who returned to the grove after Engel left, who retrieved the letter from Jean-Luc's study, and who had the most to gain by concealing the scroll." Sylvie's voice stiffened. "And you believe that was me?" Poirot turned to her gently. "Madame, you are the only one who spoke of Jean-Luc's increasing isolation as a danger to himself. You told me of a man spiraling toward madness, but Engel saw a man breaking under the weight of a secret." He shifted his gaze to Nadine. "And you, mademoiselle, were the only one who saw the letter Jean-Luc drafted, the one naming you as sole custodian of his unpublished works. Curiously, that letter disappeared." Nadine paled. Poirot continued. "It was you who had the keys to the study, you who logged the scroll into the villa's archive, yet the parchment Engel found in the grove bore no record of that. Meaning Jean-Luc never gave it to you?" Sylvie's chair creaked slightly. "What are you saying?" Poirot stepped back. "I'm saying that Jean-Luc Leclerc did not die by suicide, nor was he murdered out of hatred. He was pushed into the ravine in a moment of desperation. Someone confronted him, demanded the scroll, perhaps the letter too." Nadine trembled. "I didn't—" But Poirot raised a hand, stopping her. "No, mademoiselle, you are not the killer." He turned slowly to Sylvie. "It was you who followed Jean-Luc after Engel left. You who saw him bury the scroll. You who retrieved it before the authorities arrived. But there was one problem. Milo had seen you." Sylvie froze, expression faltering. Poirot lowered his voice. "That is why you returned to the garden that night, not to mourn, but to ensure the child had not told anyone. You found him asleep, clutching his drawings. You took only the one that showed you at the grove." Her voice cracked. "He was my husband. He was losing his mind. He was trying to protect you from disgrace, from the truth of what the scroll revealed about the family's legacy. But he never suspected you would silence him to protect a name." Sylvie stood, shaking. You can't prove any of this. Poirot gave a sad, tight nod. No, but Milo can. At that moment, footsteps approached. The boy, hand in hand with Isabel, walked slowly toward them. On the other hand, he clutched a fresh drawing, one he had not shown anyone. It depicted a woman with flowing hair, standing over a kneeling man near the olive tree, her face streaked with tears, one hand pushing him away. Sylvie's knees buckled. Poirot caught her gently by the arm. Chapter 17. The Truth That Was Buried. The salon was dim again. Late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, painting fine shadows across the floor. Poirot sat in an armchair, fingers laced together, eyes heavy with weariness. And something else. Grief, perhaps. Across from him sat Commissioner Delange, his notepad open, pen poised but unmoving. Sylvie Leclerc had been taken into custody less than an hour ago, escorted with quiet dignity by 2 officers from Avignon. She had not resisted. She had not spoken. She never meant to kill him, Delange said finally, the words more observation than judgment. Poirot nodded slowly. No, but one push, done in anger, in pain, perhaps even love twisted by legacy, and it was done. The body fell, the scroll remained hidden, the truth with it. He sighed. It is a tragedy, not only of death, but of silence. Had she spoken to him? Had he trusted her? Delange's brows furrowed. And the scroll? Poirot gestured toward the low table, where a faded fragment now rested between 2 panes of glass. A museum team was due to arrive the next day. She tried to burn it, Poirot said softly. But it was old parchment, treated by monks with oils that resist flame. She panicked and buried it. Later, she retrieved it, unsure of what to do. When she saw Milo watching from the orchard, she realized what he might have seen. She followed him that night, found him asleep, and took the drawing, but the boy remembered. Delange glanced toward the hallway. He saw everything. Poirot nodded, and he could not speak it, but he could draw. A quiet knock came at the door. Isabel stepped in, holding Milo's hand. The boy walked in without hesitation, his eyes flicking toward Poirot with quiet trust. Poirot smiled. Come, mon petit. Sit. Milo climbed onto the settee beside him. Isabel lingered near the doorway, watching silently. Poirot leaned slightly toward the boy. You helped me, you know. Your drawings. They told the truth. Milo looked down, fingers tracing the hem of his sleeve. Delange gave a gentle nod. You did a very brave thing, Milo. Poirot turned to Isabel. Will you stay with him? Her answer was immediate. Yes, I've already spoken to social services. His mother's family in Lyon has been contacted. But until then, he's with me. Poirot rose. He stepped to the table and looked down at the ancient script once more. In the stillness, he thought he could hear Jean-Luc's voice, quiet, poetic, filled with the passion of one who believed that history had to be told, no matter the consequences. Delange stood. And so, the legacy passes on. Poirot gave a small, tired smile. Not the legacy of names, monsieur. The legacy of truth, of courage. The boy is the future. Let us not fail him. Delange nodded, and the commissioner stepped away, leaving Poirot with the boy, the young teacher, and the weight of one man's final choice. Outside, the wind rustled the olive trees. The garden bench stood empty, bathed in golden light. But this time, the silence held peace. Chapter 18. The final arrangement. A week had passed since the quiet arrest, and already the villa had shifted. The once claustrophobic hush had lifted, though grief lingered like old incense in the corners. Poirot remained in Avignon a little longer than planned, though he did not say why. Only Georges knew, and he kept the valet's discretion like polished silver. On the morning of his departure, Poirot stood once more in the garden. The air was soft with the scent of lavender and trimmed grass. A blackbird chirped somewhere beyond the hedge. The bench where Jean-Luc had sat in solitude, wrestling with truth too heavy to carry, was now occupied by young Milo, pencil in hand, a pad on his lap. Isabelle sat beside him, watching, her smile gentle and unreadable. Poirot approached quietly. Milo looked up. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, the name now smooth in his small voice. Poirot bowed slightly. "Mon artiste. You draw again?" Milo nodded and tilted the sketch pad. It showed a tree, twisted and bare, but its roots were full of life. Vines curled around coins, scrolls, even bones. Poirot smiled. "A tree with secrets. Très juste." Isabelle stood. "He's healing, monsieur. Slowly, but he speaks more each day." Poirot looked at the boy. "And when you do not speak, you still say much." Milo gave a small, bashful grin. The detective turned to Isabelle. "And Sylvie?" Isabelle sighed. "Confessed everything, the push, the panic, her belief that the scroll would ruin the Leclerc name if made public. She was prepared to take it to her grave." Poirot's face remained calm, a grave that another nearly filled. Isabelle hesitated. "Do you think she regrets it?" Poirot considered. "Regret is a poor tailor. It fits no one. But remorse? Yes. That I believe." He fell silent a moment, gazing toward the olive trees. She loved Jean-Luc. Not in the way one sings about, no, but fiercely, as one protects a family legend. She could not bear the thought that he would become a footnote in the museum plaques he once curated. Isabelle's voice dropped. But she silenced the man who loved truth above all. Poirot nodded solemnly. "Ah, mademoiselle, we must learn to make peace with complexity. Sylvie was both protector and betrayer. Jean-Luc, both martyr and fool. You, both witness and guardian now." She said nothing. Instead, she looked at Milo. "He made us all face the truth." Poirot touched his hat brim, then reached into his coat and drew out a small envelope. "This is for you." Isabelle took it, puzzled. Inside was a bank letter, modest but meaningful. A donation had been made in Jean-Luc Leclerc's name to the Avignon Historical Foundation for the preservation of untold histories. "And this," Poirot said, withdrawing a second envelope, smaller, "is for Milo." Milo looked up, wide-eyed. Poirot handed him a card, simple and white, with embossed lettering. To the young artist whose silence spoke louder than all of France. Hercule Poirot. The boy held the card like a holy thing. Poirot bent slightly. "Draw always, mon ami. Let no truth be buried, not again." Milo nodded slowly, and for the first time, took Poirot's hand in his. The detective looked down and gave a quiet, fatherly smile. Later, Poirot stood at the train platform, his luggage beside him, hat firmly adjusted, moustaches gleaming in the morning light. Georges had taken his seat already, but Poirot remained outside, savoring the air one final time. A voice behind him spoke. "You could have left days ago." Poirot turned. Commissioner Delange, now in plain clothes, offered him a small nod. "I remain when my soul tells me there is still something to observe," Poirot replied. "And has it told you all is finished?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "No, but it tells me all is begun. The child draws. The scroll is preserved. The name Leclerc, though scarred, will be remembered not for silence, but for truth." Delange extended a hand. Poirot took it. "You're a difficult man, Poirot," Delange said, "but a necessary one." Poirot smiled modestly. "And you are a good man, monsieur. Even if you doubted my theories about artists and orchard shadows." The whistle blew. Poirot turned, boarding the train with graceful finality. As the train pulled away, he watched the countryside roll past. Fields of sunflowers, winding rivers, the hint of ruins half sunk in time. Poirot closed his eyes. Another case concluded, another soul set free, another child who had drawn the truth, and in doing so, restored the balance that murder tried to steal.